So if any of you who were here last year may remember that Sheila Warren over here moderated the very first panel discussion. It was actually a fireside chat of the 2024 Samaritz conference. There, they were talking about macro. And I think the key takeaway, at least my key takeaway, was that 2024 was going to be the most consequential year in democratic history, that is, say, for democracies, as there were going to be more elections in a single year, democratic elections, than had ever happened before. From will Taiwan decide to hire a president that's pro or anti-communist China, all the way through to the end of the year, the US general election. And indeed, it was as consequential as we thought it might be. So here to discuss it are some of the preeminent experts on Earth. You already have their bios in your packets, so you feel free to go there. But I want to start by talking a little bit about the first 4 years before we talk about Trump's victory and kind of what that means. Sheila, you've been leading kind of one of the major trade groups in this industry since the beginning, a policy research firm that's been on both sides of the aisle, from states to federal. You've been really looking into this. What are some of the, I'm going to call it, accomplishments, if I may, under the Biden administration over the last 4 years when it comes to crypto?
So the accomplishments, is that the question?
I use that word.
Let's define our terms.
Italicized.
Okay, fair enough. Look, I'll start off by saying nailed it last year with that presentation, because I think Christopher Smart, who was on stage with me, we did call it that this was going to be a tremendously consequential year election-wise. And I'll start by saying what we saw was basically a trouncing of incumbents. And this is well known and well covered, but regardless of whether things moved more to the left or more to the right, depended more on who was in power last year than seemingly many other factors that you think would be more dispositive, frankly, than in some cases they turned out to be. But when it comes to the Biden administration, I think you have to look across the 4 years in totality. And so the first 2 years of that administration, you had a pretty neutral to positive stance on crypto, actually, if we're being honest. And then we had FTX and that whole situation. And then you had 2 years of really outright, in some cases, outright war against crypto.
So hold on, I want to ask, was it really? Because listen, if you read crypto Twitter, it has been outright war.
Yeah.
Choke point 2.0 comes up all the time. I want to ask you sincerely, is that the case?
Yeah, it depends on, that's what I was going to say, it's nuanced, right? So I think a lot of people in crypto focus on the SEC, on Gary Gensler, and on the absolute barrage of enforcement actions that erupted and really continue, actually. I mean, continue as of yesterday, from what I understand. So there's a lot of that, I think, that folks looked at. Yeah, so, and that's fair. I think it's fair to say that Chairman Gensler really did seem to be very anti this industry, and that was played out in the way enforcement actions were made. On the other hand, I think you did have positive movement. We can't contest that we had actually a bill come through the House. It was fully bipartisan, with support from both sides of the aisle, massive support for that bill, including from most major industry actors.
Which bill are we referring to in this case?
Fit 21,
yeah.
Called Fit 21. And that actually got through, and we were instrumental in passing that, so I'll credit the team there. But regardless, it was an industry effort, right, that we really were in the center of coordinating. That got through. And so it's difficult. It's more nuanced than people want to think, right? Because again, we had Republicans in charge of the House the last 2 terms, the last 2 years, the last congressional term. We still have that going forward, and there were a lot of conversations happening there. The reality behind the scenes is that there were a number of shots on goal, and part of the challenge was industry alignment, to be very frank.
And when we say shots on goal, do we mean the crypto industry screwing up? And are you talking about FTX or something different?
I think that we handled the FTX situation in mixed ways, right? Yeah. I think the surprise that people had in industry, and we can go into this as much detail as you all want, the surprise that we had about the reaction to it was, I think, surprising, frankly. I mean, we had this guy who went around and really was making a particular case for crypto, was doing that in a lot of ways, throwing around a lot of money, getting a lot of people on side, who were then very embarrassed by how public that disaster and ongoing and unfolding calamity really was, right? Just every time you turned around, there was more press and everything else. I think the other thing, and you know better than any of us on this, David, that people underestimated was that political, like the public opinion, sort of the normie media kind of attention was not positive about crypto, even going into, that debacle, right? People were highly skeptical in the media. And so that was a moment where you just generated tons of press attention. And I mean, from the hair to the whole thing, the Bahamas, the whole thing, there was a lot of salacious detail. And we all know that's what gets a lot of clicks and attention. So
one of the things, sorry, just to jump in here, one of the things that made people skeptical, to your point, was that they were based in the Bahamas. One of the reasons they were based in the Bahamas was that there was no way they could get U.S. approval
yes and no.
for their full-on exchange.
That's right. That's right.
There were only certain elements of it. Chris, the last 4 years, you have not been in office. You were chairman of the CFTC previously under the first Trump administration. You also were quite familiar with Mr. Gensler and how his stance maybe has shifted. Do you think that Sheila's right that it was embarrassment that kind of turned up the notches and we went all the way to 11 on enforcement actions, or is it more principled than that?
I think it's both. I think it's both. The best defense for the political class was a good offense, and the offense was to turn against crypto because they were embarrassed by their susceptibility to Sam Bankman-Fried. But, nothing's a monolith, and certainly the Democrats are not a monolith. Gary Gensler gets all the press, along with Elizabeth Warren, for being hostile, but not all elements of the last 4 years. Certainly my former agency, the CFTC, under leadership by Chairman Benham, remained very open-minded, very balanced in its approach throughout, and others did as well. However, actions have consequences, and I think, sadly, despite really good action by the CFTC and Democrats in Congress and others, the last 4 years will be remembered, at least from crypto, for some really bad overall policy. Debanking, crypto debanking, bad policy. Hostility to institutional custody, bad policy.
Yeah.
Hostility to self-custody, bad policy. Regulation by enforcement, bad policy.
So, I want to almost unpack these individually because they're all quite interesting. In fact, we saw that institutional custody became an issue. It was a bipartisan issue that got passed until it wasn't. Sheila, what happened there?
What didn't happen there? I think what happened there was politics. Okay, so there is a... Look, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I think moving forward, and maybe the look back is helpful, but I actually think we should focus on what's happening now and when moving forward into this new administration. We don't have that much time, but I think that we're the dog who caught the car, right? And so now, basically, crypto. Now that we've won, right, and now that we have many people in senior leadership positions all over the administration and in Congress, and it is agency heads at least forthcoming is what's believed to be happening. We have to kind of align on what we want. And so part of what happened, to go back and answer your question retrospectively, around that bill that passed the House that I mentioned that then had a chance in the Senate, and it really did have a very real chance, is you just couldn't get alignment from people. And so people were kind of gambling it, right? I think there was an August time frame where there was a lot of work on a Senate companion. So in the United States, if you have a House bill, you have to have a Senate bill, they have to kind of reconcile with each other, and then you get something passed, right? So going through one House is
before
a big
it gets signed or not.
Before it gets signed or not, exactly. And we could talk about SAB 121 anytime you want, because wow, what a failure that was. Moving forward, I think the question is going to be, how do we align? And so in August, we had a lot of alignment. People were like, okay, we're not sure how the election's going to play out, who's going to be in leadership positions. We have some very key people, Patrick McHenry in the House, even Chuck Schumer in the Senate, who are really want to get this done, whether because of fatigue, because they want credit for it, for whatever legacy, whatever reasons. They have their own reasons. They want to get something across the line. Okay, so that was very clear, and anyone who says that's not true is not
Yeah, and
honest.
even Democrats seem to, at the time
They
anyway,
very much wanted
they were
to get it over
courting
with.
the crypto vote.
Yeah.
Because, and actually, Teresa, I do want to ask you about this. There was more lobbying turnout for crypto by far than any time in history, and it perhaps was the single most influential, trade group that was influencing the 24 general election. But Sheila, I want to go back to talking a little bit more about kind of, to your point, this bipartisan effort to at least get something done.
Yeah. Well, then people were just willing to gamble that there would be a Republican sweep, which there was, turned out to be a fair bet. And then the idea was we'd get something better. Let's wait and get something better across the line later, rather than taking what we can get now. And that's a perfectly legitimate posture, but it wasn't shared by everybody. And so there was a lot of tension within industry actors about what do we do? Do we take the shot on goal that we had to get this thing across the line that's far from perfect, but will land some clarity? Or do we wait and see and gamble with the election?
So now here where we are. We got a little bit, according to what I've heard here, across the line in the last 4 years. There's been a lot of enforcement actions. There's been a lot of fear and trepidation. And the media certainly has been listening to what the government has to say and perhaps has been parroting some of that fear. At least that's my personal observations there. Meanwhile, there was this enormous campaign to from crypto and things that are adjacent to crypto to bring in candidates that were, I'm going to call it, more crypto-friendly on both sides of the aisle. Fair Shake, for example, as a political action committee, was able to get a lot of candidates elected that they had supported. Teresa, what's your take on kind of that campaign process and how things have turned out thus far?
I think it was really effective to have the crypto community so engaged and to be putting so much money, putting the money where their mouth is, right? And that's really made a huge difference because we saw Trump going to industry leaders and getting their feedback, and it really did make a difference. And throughout the entire process, even senators, these people who are right next to Trump making these decisions were asking, what does crypto think of this? Like, what does the industry think of this person in particular? Because the way that it works basically is, there's a list of all the different possible nominees for a particular position, and then next to your name it would be parentheses of all the different people who support you, who have their position is influential, and Trump wants to know who they support. And then crypto was in there, and crypto also would support the supporters. And so the supporters would want to know what crypto was saying, and so you would end up having not only a crypto supporter, but a supporter who, recommended somebody based on crypto. So it was really incredible.
And, well, the election happened, and according to Kalshi and Polymarket, of course, which is a blockchain-based election platform, or election betting platform, among other things, general prediction market, Trump won. There was a Republican sweep. And even if it's a rather thin House majority right now, the 3-senator lead for the Republicans, plus J.D. Vance as vice president in the event of a tie, is quite a large number. And it seems like, at least thus far, many of Trump's cabinet appointees are going to get passed, which is yet another test of Trump's power, I should say, in leading. Chris, you've been talking and working with the transition team kind of for some time. My understanding is you had breakfast recently with David Sachs, the incoming crypto czar. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what the U.S.'s direction is going to be now that Trump has won in relatively convincing fashion? Yeah,
so I would say the Trump crypto agenda would fall into 3 buckets. The easy to do, the challenging to do, the very hard to do. The easy to do is to end the bad policies that I described a minute ago. Get rid of regulation enforcement begins day one with Acting Chair Hester Peirce or Acting Chair Mark Ueda beginning on January 20th.
That's a big deal.
The ending of the debanking ends with firing personnel responsible for the debanking to begin with, and a neutral policy toward crypto activity. Ending hostility to institutional custody by ending Staff Accounting Bulletin of the SEC 121. That can be ended pretty quickly. And then the hostility to self-hosting. That's going to take some rulemaking out of Treasury and the IRS, but that can be done. So the easy part is ending bad policy. The second bucket is promises made need to be delivered. Promises about a U.S. stockpile.
That was one hell of an event at Bitcoin Nashville when Trump stood there and said, we're going to have a Bitcoin reserve.
So I'm going to predict right now, and here it's going to begin on January 20th with an executive order ordering Treasury not to sell any more crypto and sell any more Bitcoin. They have large holdings because of confiscation for IRS and other law enforcement activities. The Biden administration has been actively selling it. They'll end the sale, so right then you begin the stockpile. How you go about adding to it's a second question, but that'll begin, I think, right away. And I think that'll be welcome news, certainly in the Bitcoin community. Other promises, a crypto council. The statutory framework exists under our federal advisory board laws. That can begin out of the NEC to begin that council. There's been a lot of talk about membership on it. I think that begins pretty quickly. Other things are going to take a little more work in terms of the second bucket of promises. Ending capital gains treatment of crypto sales is going to have to be built into the new tax reform, tax policy.
It seems like it's going to be a rather high lift.
Those will be hard. But let me get to the very hard to do.
Harder than that.
Okay. Remember I said the easy part is actually getting rid of bad policy.
Yeah.
The hard part is actually going to be getting good policy. And that's where we're going to need bipartisanship. And I think we will have it. But over 200 congressional men and women were elected this term on platforms of being pro-crypto. They need to deliver on that promises. And how do they do that? They take a piece of the bill and they put their own special sauce. They give it to their supporters. They get some action. If the White House doesn't run herd on stablecoin legislation, on crypto legislation, any of them could become what we call dog's breakfasts and pulled apart by a million different ways. The industry, an industry that, unlike any other industry, has not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 trade associations that has L1s, in opposition to other L1s, that have exchanges fighting other exchanges. This industry is going to have to finally come together, and those shots on goal are really going to have to score. And so, as I say, getting good policy is going to be hard work, and it's going to take all of us to come together to make sure. But if we get good policy in the U.S., I think good policy in the U.S. is going to translate to the rest of the world. We're going to go to a new environment.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit later. I want to talk more about the United States right now and what's going to hit. Teresa, what's your take?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things too with industry coming together, and I think that that's really important, and this is how you generally get things done. If you wait for government to come and tell you what the answer is, you're never going to like it. You're always going to say that's not right. So you always have to come together, and this is what every other industry does. And I think that's really important for us to do now. And here is coming together, and it's these kinds of public dialogues. And in doing that with the shots on goal, if some people see them as shots on goal, but I didn't quite see them the same way because you were so limited in what you could come up with. Right now, because we have J.D. Vance, because we have Howard Lutnick and Besson and all these different people, you can think bigger, think broader. You don't have to have these tiny little carve-outs here and there and try and do something that's really not the ideal. This really needs kind of a national approach, which is what Trump wants to do within the first 100 days. And that is, it's
100 days is quite fast.
It is fast, but I think it's doable.
You think it's doable?
I do.
Sheila?
This is very interesting. Okay, so I think I just want to go back to what Chris said, because I think it is so accurate. Like, it is absolutely imperative that industry be aligned. And it was really, ask me how I know, it was hard enough to get industry alignment when we were in a defensive crouch, which we certainly were the last 2 years, if not the last 4. Now that everybody wants exactly what they want, and they want exactly what they want. They want words that are in legislation. They want particular postures. They want timing of things to go in a certain order. Like, people have very specific demands, and they're not aligned, right? And so part of the job of associations, and I should be very clear, I'm here in my personal capacity today, but part of that job is really trying to herd all those cats and then herd cats across these different competitors who now are seeing the possibility of landing a very real competitive advantage in the United States at the exclusion of others that are their competitors, right? Whereas before, we actually did have pretty broad alignment on the broad goals, but we can get to that level of detail.
Well, because it
right?
seemed at the time, if I were an L1 or I was an exchange or a stablecoin issuer, that there were very few things that could conceivably be passed.
Well,
but now there's this paradox of choice, right, where everything is possible potentially.
Well, yes and no. I mean, right? So that's where I actually disagree. So I think that there's certainly more surface area now than there was before. And there's no question having a Republican Congress, having Republicans in the White House is better for crypto than the alternative.
Yeah, but there's also pro-crypto Democrats. I mean,
well,
this is worth noting. There's plenty of them.
It's going to have to be bipartisan, and that's the point I wanted to really draw out of what Chris said. You don't have an option. It's going to have to be bipartisan legislation no matter what happens.
Especially if you want to raise money.
That's true in the House and true in the Senate, especially if you want to raise money. So I think the question is going to become whether 100 days or not. I love exactly what you said. I think it's really important to note that the most challenging things for industry are going to be gone right away because they are in that easy bucket. Debanking, massive issue, gone. Like, just day one, even day pre-1, right? We're already seeing
this is enormously valuable. Again, for everyone in the audience who's not in the United States, and I'm one of these people who were affected in the past, you could lose your corporate bank account and your personal bank account for being associated with crypto. This wasn't true for just crypto traders, rather anonymous people, but for institutions and companies. So you couldn't make payroll. And this, I can't imagine a bigger chilling effect for businesses that might operate in the United States than saying, we might take away your ability for your employees to pay their rent.
It wasn't just in the United States either. It was global, because the way that the banks work too is if you were going to have a customer who the United States was debanking, then the U.S. banks would penalize those banks, foreign banks, who were going to still bank those people. So it had a really international reach that I think wasn't
That's a big deal.
This is going to be the year, I think, when we're here next year on this stage, we're going to look back and look at 2025 as the year that TradFi moved in a big way, because the sanction, the regulatory risk, the compliance risk from people like Gary Gensler is gone. So even if we don't get good policy in the first year, and there's a fair chance we don't, we're still debating that in Congress a year from now, taking away the debanking, taking away the hostility to institutional custody, those two things alone, taking away the random Wells notices coming out of the SEC.
Yeah.
Wells notices are notices giving to companies saying the SEC is about to sue you, that they would issue, even if they didn't intend to sue. Sometimes a year would go by and they still hadn't brought a suit, but they froze.
And what was the purpose of that?
To freeze the companies in place. Because they were about to embark upon some creative crypto strategy, and the SEC got wind of it, so they'd issue a Wells notice and freeze them in place.
I have a very dumb question for all of you. Is it true that essentially every major U.S. crypto exchange has been served by the SEC? Been sued?
Yeah,
Or
I
at least
believe
threatened?
so. Yeah.
I think that's
It's
right.
to cut the knees off of them.
And the traditional exchanges.
How are you supposed to exist then?
We're
Right.
told by
Well,
their
that's why.
regulators,
Yeah.
stay in TradFi and don't go into crypto. So the
Yeah.
major exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and others, were told, stay in your lane, don't go into crypto. And then the crypto exchanges got subpoenas, got Wells notices.
Yeah.
And so the elimination of that stance, of that hostility, is so massive. And
Okay, so honestly-
we can debate all day. But one second, we can debate all day. You know, how hard is it going to be to get policy across? I'm a cynic, or I would say a realist. It's very hard to get legislation through. It's just very, 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 very hard. And to prioritize it in the Congress, it's much easier to get things through agencies. However, we can't ignore the fact that there's states, right, who are going to start getting even more active than they've been. And we're now, the Trump administration is in a federal state posture where they're changing things, and they have explicitly said they want more power to the states on a lot of different areas. Crypto's not immune to that.
So
okay?
what can states do, realistically? Because states, for
Licensing
example,
regimes?
banking charters are very often issued by states.
Yep, banking charters, licensing regimes. I think we're seeing
Crypto
tremendous
stockpiles
MPLs or money transmitter
stockpiles.
stockpiles, crypto stockpiles. It can go both ways. It can be positive or negative, right? So it wouldn't surprise me if you see crypto stockpiles at the state level. I could see Wyoming, for example, going really big on something like that, and other similar states. You're also going to see activity from New York and California. The
Which
two
might be-
licensing regimes, which may not be as positive, shall we
Yeah.
say, right? So, and a lot of things are going to have to adjust in real time to what's happening across 50 states. The worst case scenario, in my opinion, would be something analogous to money transmitters, where you have to license in 50 different, what a nightmare, 50 different times. You got to go through this process. Will there be reciprocity? We don't know. You kind of want the feds to come in and say, here is the national scheme. But if that takes a lot longer than people want, they may opt to go a state route.
So this could slow things down, but
It's
it
just
can't
hard to know.
stop things, probably.
No, and I think it depends what the approach is, right? Because what my understanding Trump wants to do is have a national approach. That doesn't mean you need legislation in effect.
Correct.
And even the legislation that's gone through, like Fit 21, is impractical. It'll never happen. The SEC is never going to opine whether or not every single asset is a security or not.
They
But,
certainly haven't so far.
So that's just never going to happen. And then also, we probably won't even be applying Howey. So, it doesn't even really make sense. So I think, if you come up with a national policy and you have everybody's buy-in, then, we can do what we've historically done in other cases, like the SEC and CFTC have done. They've come up with an accord and, a jurisdictional accord, and they work things out. And then there's lots of different ways that you can implement that without legislation. There's huge, broad exemptive relief under the Commodities Exchange Act and under the securities laws. And so the different agencies can actually just implement the policies, but it should be a national approach so everybody's aligned, but you don't need any legislation, and then the legislation can come after the fact to solidify it and make it harder to change.
So the regulators can first. Sheila, you first and
Well, I
Chris.
think that's the point. I think people think, oh, you have to have legislation to get things done. And the point I think that both of you are making, which I agree with, is that isn't really true necessarily in many cases, right, to move. I think there is going to be a little bit of a race that we see, and the question is going to become, what is the White House's priority list? Like, what is that priority list? What do they feel they have to deliver on first? Because let's not forget, this was a coalition that came together to elect President Trump. It's not just crypto. And I know we all like to navel gaze here and believe we're the most important people in your room, and in this room we certainly are. But a lot of folks came together to get this person elected and this administration in power, and there's a lot of promises made. And the question of where you fall in that force ranking of priorities and what is the biggest priority and all of that, that's still to be determined, right? So we tend to read a lot of crypto press and crypto Twitter and all of that, and we see kind of the direction of travel for us, but everyone else is doing that for themselves too. So what do you get when is going to really matter, particularly because of state activity, in my opinion. And so we do a lot of work at the CCI, there's a lot of work at the state level to make sure that those regimes are also positive, productive, they're not overly burdensome, et cetera. Right?
I want to talk. Sorry, Chris,
I
go,
do
and
want to
then
make
I
a
have to
point.
talk about the individuals.
Just a real quick point. I think the biggest change that's going to happen on January 20th is the United States is going to go back to its traditional posture of not asking permission, but begging for forgiveness. I think what we've been the last 2 years is everybody's afraid to move, and not getting
Everyone being
permission
industry.
in the industry. But actually, it's not just limited to crypto. A lot of innovation industries, including AI, have had some reluctance without getting permission from Washington. I think what the big change is going to be is let 1,000 flowers bloom. You don't necessarily need to come to Washington to get permission to do things. Go do it. And as the rules evolve, it'll become clearer. But I think we're going to get back to the same ethos that built Silicon Valley, that built the internet, which is go out and break things, and then we'll deal with the consequences.
That is bullish as it can be. I want to start talking about individuals. That is very bullish and a little bit counter maybe to what Arthur just told us here on stage. But I want to talk through who these people are. So who is David Sachs? This is the new crypto czar. What is a crypto czar? Chris?
So a crypto czar.
By the way, let's try and keep these quick because there's a bunch of people to
it's
go.
something that wasn't proposed during the campaign, but it just became a logical necessity to deliver on all these promises, that there needed to be somebody on the White House staff whose job it was to wake up every morning and say, how do we get all this done? The position is going to be as an assistant to the president under existing presidential statutory framework. David Sachs is going to be both the czar for crypto and AI, and then he's going to have deputies like Bo Hines, who will be the point person on crypto. There'll be another point person on AI to do the job.
Are they employed by the White House then? Are they employed by the White House, or are they volunteer?
So Hines will be a special assistant to the president under that statute. David Sachs is creating his own structure as a volunteer. He can't work more than 180 hours days a year to stay not full time. So he's actually going to run his his venture fund at the same time. So it's going to be challenging. We do need to talk about some of the agency
a literal
well.
halftime
Yes.
crypto czar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Crypto and AI czar. So there's crypto and AI czar.
That's right. So we got 1/4 of the year.
But don't underestimate. David Sachs is a very impressive person. He was with Elon Musk at PayPal. He's made several fortunes during the course of his lifetime. He's quick, smart. And so it's a different approach.
So he's the quarterback for the White House.
He's the head coach.
The head coach
on crypto.
Even better.
Running that team.
All right. So and we talked about Bo Hines.
Trump owns the team. He's the head coach.
And Bo Hines is going to be running the
offensive
council.
coordinator.
He's going to be running the council, which there's going to be perhaps, at least I remember at Bitcoin Nashville, Trump said that he was going to select a number of industry experts, perhaps some of the folks in this room, who are going to perhaps advise on all things related to crypto. Is that correct?
It looks like it's emerging to be more industry CEOs.
Okay.
But yes, it's going to be a council, I think, of a lot of important crypto CEOs.
Okay, so that's on the White House side. What about regulators? We've certainly seen that there's a new selected or nominated SEC chair, Paul Atkins, who you went to law school with, as it turns out.
Yeah. Put your seatbelts on, folks. Paul Atkins is going to be one of the finest SEC chairmen in the history of that agency. He's born to it. He was a former commissioner. The two Republican commissioners that are there both worked in his office. He's got a Washington Rolodex of anybody that's ever come into contact with the SEC that's better than none. He understands not only the securities and exchange laws, he understands the building. He knows where the centers of power are. He knows how to reform it. There's been a lot of damage done to that agency over the last 4 years. In my personal opinion, I think there's nobody better than Paul to repair that damage to the agency, damage to its reputation, and get that agency up and running. And he is one of the founding members of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. He understands crypto.
A crypto trade group.
He's really, we got lucky with the next chairman of the SEC. I think he's going to be excellent.
Teresa, you're a former SEC attorney yourself. You're familiar with Paul's thinking. You're friends as well. Do you agree with Chris?
Yeah, I think Paul is excellent, and I think he is going to be one of the best chairs. And he was on the commission when my former mentor, Harvey Pitt, was the chairman. And I consider Paul a good friend, and I think he's going to be excellent. The libertarian view that he has, very pro-competition. He's he's been very outspoken about dissenting from, not just crypto, but also things in the market that make it overly complex, overly prescriptive and things like that are just really bad for our markets. He does have his work made out for him. I mean, this is a really tough lift that he has, and it's getting even heavier because all of these bombs that are being thrown in these last days, it's not just like trying to sell off all the Bitcoin from Silk Road.
Do you mean the SEC's last hurrahs?
Yesterday they filed an action against Elon Musk. Earlier, a few days ago, against WWE, the World Wrestling thing, and one of the McMahons, Linda McMahon, is going to be nominated for
Robin Hood
secretary. Yeah, $45 million against Robin Hood, former SEC Commissioner Dan Gallagher, who is very close with Paul Atkins too, and he was on Paul's staff with Hester person Mark Ueda when Paul was a commissioner. So there's all these kind of moving parts. And
so that's SEC.
Yeah.
We don't have that much time, so I want to make sure we go to others. We can talk a little bit about CFTC, but I'm pretty sure the next panelist is going to be able to talk a little bit about that as well, Chris. But thus far, I just want to say there has been no declaration of a new SEC chair. Isn't that correct?
No,
CFTC, forgive me.
CFTC, correct.
Not publicly,
Yes,
but
not publicly.
yeah.
Sheila, do you have intel on this?
Of course, I'm not going to share it. But, yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. What about OCC and any other major...
FDIC. We need
FDIC.
major
FDIC.
reform at the FDIC.
I think, can I just comment on
Please.
this briefly? Because I think people really, again, patience is the watchword, right? Because these folks who come into these two agencies in particular are inheriting a morale issue. There's a lot of just management and leadership work that has to be done. And so we're not a patient industry, generally speaking. And I really want to counsel everyone, recognize that, right? These folks are public servants. They didn't have to take these jobs. We should be very grateful they're willing to do this service, okay? These are not easy things to manage. These are massive bureaucracies. They're going to be in the middle of this DOGE effort to eliminate things, and what does that mean for them, and all this and that. So there's a lot that's going to happen here, but nowhere does that, I think, land more than at the FDIC. So I'll tee you up with that.
Absolutely true. I mean,
let's finish this and then we'll move on to the audience questions.
so like the SEC, the FDIC has got major, deep-seated human issues, human and personnel issues. As I found when I ran the CFTC, you go there wanting to do policy, you wind up spending a lot of time simply managing. And you have to manage it because you can only achieve things with your people. And if your people are unhappy, if they're not with the game, not with the plan, you've got to bring people around. Leadership really matters. That's why it's so important that the nominees be people of leadership capability. That's why I think Paul Atkins is great. There's two existing commissioners at the CFTC. Either one of them will be named acting chairman on day one. We should hear that.
We'll see what happens after that. All right, one more thing before we go to this question. We should talk about the actual people elected for a second. So Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance both seem pretty pro-crypto themselves. Do you think they're going to play roles in helping shape crypto policy as opposed to just the people they've appointed?
Yes.
Sheila?
Yes, for better and for worse.
For better or for worse. Okay, well, you heard it here. Terrific. Bill Ty asks, Chris, is there any legislation from the CFTC that institutes an asset tax on digital assets in 2026? Apparently, there might be a tax on holdings over $1 billion. Have you heard about this?
So it would have come out of the CFTC. It's not a tax writing agency. I'm not aware of any legislation in the underlying tax law that would give the basis for that. So I'm not sure.
So that rumor may or may not be
asset tax on digital assets. Oh, the alternative minimum tax. Oh. So yeah, there is talk about an IRS interpretation, if I've got this right, that would perhaps interpret that way. Now, having said that, Trump has indicated that he wishes to get a exemption for capital gains taxes on crypto. So the tax reform is going to be one of the very first bills to come out of this Congress. Trump has indicated that extending his original 2018 tax cuts is one of his primary jobs, and crypto will be part of that. So that interpretation may be fixed in tax legislation.
One more question for Saul while we have a few minutes. We've just heard about what's going to happen in the United States. Seems like there's going to be quite a lot of change very quickly, perhaps some more down the road with some roadblocks. But we're here in Switzerland right now. We're here in St. Moritz. And there's many people from all over the globe, investors, CEOs, chairpersons from all over the globe here. If the US moves towards crypto, what do you think this means for the rest of the world?
I think it's going to be tremendous for the rest of the world, because I think the United States has been the biggest downer on crypto for the last 4 years. I think changing that, I think with activity that have moved from the US, moved offshore, returning to the US, with innovation in the US, I think other jurisdictions are going to have to up their game. I think we're going to quickly see MiCA go into MiCA 2.0 because it is, I don't think it's terribly effective. Jurisdictions like UAE and others that have enjoyed a lot of traffic from the United States are going to have to look to service European and Asian commerce, because I think a lot of that's going to come back to the United States. But overall, I think that a more competitive United States at first is going to be challenging to the rest of the world, but I think it's actually, and here's where maybe I agree with Arthur Hayes, I didn't agree with a lot of what he said. I think Europe's going to have to up its game if the United States, and you know, I'll tell you what, this administration is not just pledged to crypto innovation, but it's AI, it's quantum, it's biotech, it's nanotech. I mean, they want to take the shackles off all kinds of innovation. They think innovation could add another 0.5 percentage point growth. Energy alone, they think, can add 1%. If the United
certainly
States,
that has an impact on Bitcoin mining.
The United States is running at a steady state 3% economic growth, or 2.5%. Energy unleashed, and I expect an executive order declaring an energy emergency on day one, allowing all kinds of new drilling to take place. That's another 1% economic growth. Innovation's another 0.5 to 2%. The United States could get 4.5% economic growth.
Which is large for an economy like the United States.
Which would be huge for the rest of the
Sheila,
world.
you've only got a little bit of time.
Look, I've been looking at global policy for 8 years now, okay, like pretty much full time. I don't think that most of the rest of the world is going to come back to the US necessarily and transplant back home. I think the effects in Europe are exactly what Chris said. I don't think anybody in Asia really cares, to be honest. I don't see people from Singapore moving back to the United States, literally relocating their companies here. I see them licensing in the US. I see them expanding product base in the United States. I definitely think it's critical that, I mean, anything the US does in policy has follow-on effects all over the world for sure. But the edge of innovation in the APAC region is so fast.
I'll tell you why some of them might, though, because Trump has promised that this is going to be the crypto capital of the world. To do that, we need the infrastructure. Because we pushed everybody abroad, we don't have any of the infrastructure. We don't have the kind of liquidity. We don't have the exchanges. Everything that you need to build, we don't have here. So we're going to need to bring that from elsewhere. And so that's going to be a lot of incentives that go to people to come back, a lot of incentives to merge. That we're going to see a lot of, you know, growing and bigger mergers and acquisitions, things like that from foreign and abroad, and that's why I think what's going to
I'm
glad guys, we don't,
we needed
unfortunately,
semiconductors, right? And I basically
we can continue this conversation outside. So just so you all know, there's going to be a Q&A after this next fireside out there. Come ask questions to this panel. Thank you, folks.
Thanks.